Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. So we do a lot of lost treasure stories, lost gold mines, lost gold discoveries and things like that. And a good chunk of them are out in the western US, and there's some great stories we've done on this channel. And I like to mix in stories in the eastern part of the US or the Midwest when I find them and try to sprinkle them in too, because it's not all just Wild West type of stories. And this is going to be one of those stories. This is a story about some wagon train buried loot in Nebraska, and it'll be in Eastern Nebraska, Plattsmouth, Nebraska. So I'm sure I am going to get the negative comments that you're pronouncing the name wrong. It looks like it's Platt's Mouth because it is at the mouth of the Platte River as it dumps into the Missouri River. But being a Nebraska native, I know there are some towns in Nebraska that things are not pronounced like they look. So Platt's Mouth is not pronounced Platt's Mouth. It is pronounced Plattsmouth. And anyhow, so I thought I would set people straight before people start getting their keyboard fingers going and trying to claim that I'm incorrect. They did the same thing when I told a story a couple years ago about Beatrice, Nebraska, and they tried to tell me that I was pronouncing it wrong and it should have been Beatrice. So anyhow, just going to set everyone straight on that from the very get-go. And then we'll get on to today's story. So today's story happens in the late 1850s. And so in the late 1850s, now Nebraska was still quite a ways away from becoming a state. Nebraska didn't earn its statehood until 1867. So in the early stages of the territory, most settlements of any size were along the Missouri River, which is far eastern Nebraska, the eastern border, the eastern edge of Nebraska. And Plattsmouth, Nebraska was no exception. So it sat right on the western edge of the Missouri River, and it served as a major port or trade terminus along the Missouri River. So a lot of travelers heading west into the gold fields of the Rocky Mountains would enter into Nebraska at Plattsmouth, Nebraska, or maybe Brownsville downriver just a little ways, or occasionally Omaha. But at this point, Plattsmouth, I believe, was one of the biggest towns along the river. This is well before Omaha got any size to it at all. So with the Missouri River being so wide and powerful, it required a ferry to bring travelers across the river. And many of these travelers had wagons and oxen to pull their loaded down wagons westward to the mountains, and they, were heading off to the mountains to find their fortune. So Plattsmouth was one of the last places for these travelers to get outfitted and buy all of their supplies or buy additional supplies that they would need on their long journey. So many of the merchants in town knew that Plattsmouth was about the last chance to purchase these needed supplies, so these merchants were known to charge significantly higher prices for their goods than these travelers would have had to pay out east if they had come better supplied. Now, many of these merchants claimed to have extensive gold mining knowledge, and therefore they knew what these prospective gold miners and fortune hunters were going to need. So they persuaded these travelers to purchase more supplies, livestock, and goods than would really be needed. So many of these merchants also told the travelers that, hey, once they were rich, then and they would find all these riches in the Rockies, then they were welcome to return and live in Plattsmouth, as it was a really nice community. And at this point, Plattsmouth, like I said, was bigger than Omaha. I know it's kind of hard to believe today with Omaha being the main kind of urban metropolis in Nebraska, but at this point, that was not the case. Some of the southern cities on the Missouri River, like Plattsmouth and Nebraska City and Brownsville, were more of hubs on the river than Omaha ever was at this point. So people tended to go through these towns on their way west. So by this point, the merchants in town, they pretty much knew that the chances of finding gold and becoming rich in the Rocky Mountains was slim to none. They knew this because there were floods of travelers heading back east from the Rocky Mountains, and many of them were close to broke and had very little to their name once they had tried their luck in the mountains and didn't manage to find much of anything. So many of them had lost everything looking for gold and, finding little to nothing, maybe just enough to kind of keep themselves living day by day. And then eventually these travelers would come back directly through Plattsmouth, and many of them were upset that the merchants had vastly oversold them goods and supplies on their way west. So one thing you should probably know about these groups of travelers that traveled east or west on these trails is that they were very paranoid of being attacked by robbers or other people or parties or whatever. And so it became common practice when a wagon train stopped for the night to bury whatever money or gold the group possessed. So they didn't want to get robbed of all of their money that they needed on their trip. So every morning they would then dig up their cache of money and valuables and gold or whatever and continue on. And if they did happen to get robbed, which usually happened in the evening or the dark hours, they could turn their pockets inside out, showing that they had no money. And all the while their money would be buried a few feet away from their campsite. So in the early spring of 1859, there was a group of over 100 travelers heading back east. They came out of the Rocky Mountains, and they had been traveling for a few weeks when they reached the town of Plattsmouth. And as they approached the town, they reached a spot where there was a low rise just a couple miles west of town. And it was here that the group had stopped to make camp for the night. And as was the usual custom at the time, they dug a hole and everyone put their remaining money and valuables in the hole for safekeeping for the night. And this hole was said to contain gold nuggets, coins, and leather pouches containing gold dust. While no one particular person's money amounted to too much, the sum of the money from the entire group was quite substantial. It was estimated to be several $1,000s. So once the money was buried, they continued to set up camp and make a campfire and cook the evening's meal. And as this group of unlucky miners continued to set up camp, a group of enthusiastic, westward-bound, prospective gold miners approached their camp. So this group of greenhorns numbered around 200, and they had the glistening in their eyes that many excited gold miners would have, imagining their fortunes that they were going to come back with. These greenhorns had just visited the merchants in Plattsmouth, Nebraska, and of course, they had bought way more goods and supplies than were really going to be needed for this trip. The merchants, of course, had gouged and overcharged these westbound travelers, just like they did for just about all westbound travelers. As this party of westbound travelers approached the eastbound wagon train that had stopped for the evening, the eastbound travelers invited the westbound fortune seekers to join them for dinner. And I'm sure you can see exactly where this is going. But sitting around the campfire, there were rampant discussions about the conditions and the situation for gold mining in Colorado. So these newcomers, they started to find out that they were sold way more supplies and goods than they were going to be needing, and they were also sold various additional supplies that were going to be of no use in the mountains or the gold fields. Of course, they were all led to believe that gold was everywhere and they would be rich with little effort. They just needed to get there. The merchants had convinced them that it didn't really matter if they spent extra money in town, as they would soon be plenty rich. So they soon found out that they had spent their hard-earned money on many useless supplies. So, of course, these newcomers were not happy to feel that they had been taken advantage of by these merchants in town, and really neither were the eastbound travelers, as they remembered the same thing happened to them just a few months prior. Now, since the westbound group had just bought their goods a short while ago, likely just earlier the same day, many of them thought it would be a good idea for the entire group just to head back to town and try to get their money back on a lot of these goods that they just found out were going to be useless. Many of these westbound travelers were now extremely upset once they had found out, hey, it was not going to be real simple or easy to find gold. It wasn't going to be easy pickings like the merchants had led them to believe. And as the discussions continued around the campfire, the eastbound travelers also started to feel pretty upset, especially being as they were coming back without a whole lot of money left to their name. And they felt that something should be done about these merchants that were very skillful in separating them all from their money. And as resentment grew, it spread to the majority of the eastbound travelers now too. But one of these eastbound travelers, he could see that there was potential for a pretty bad altercation to happen in town very soon, and he could tell this because everyone was getting extremely upset and kind of getting whipped into an uproar. So this eastbound gentleman, he snuck out of camp and rode his horse into town to warn the merchants, as he felt that some of them might end up on the losing end of some bullets if he didn't do so. So the warnings in town were well received by the merchants and the townsfolk, and they very quickly formed a militia of men to defend their stores and their pride and their livelihood and their town. So they took up good spots beside the road into town, and they waited for the angry mob to approach. And once this angry mob of about 300 headed down the road, they were soon confronted by a well-armed militia of town citizens that greatly outnumbered them and were in much better protected positions to readily fire upon this unruly group if needed. So this group of 300 quickly realized that they were in a bad spot now, and they did not have the element of surprise on their side anymore either. So the town folk now ordered this group to drop their weapons, which they did fairly quickly and surrendered. The group was quickly herded together, and they were paraded through town in an easterly direction. Embarrassed and defeated, this group was ordered at gunpoint to cross the Missouri River to the Iowa side. They were told to swim for it or meet some rifle fire. Those that could not swim were thrown driftwood to float on and make it to the Iowa side. And it said within a half hour or so, the entire group of 300 stood on the Iowa side in the fading light, staring back across the river in disbelief at what had just happened. All they could do was shout insults and shake their fist at the townsfolk of Plattsmouth on the other side of the river. And at this point, the townsfolk just turned around and went home and went to bed. The next morning, some of the townsfolk headed a couple of miles west of town to the abandoned campsite that still had all the wagons and horses and everything still there. And the townsfolk helped themselves to, wagons, horses, oxen, cooking utensils, and many other supplies that they found at the campsite. So some of these supplies were brand new and had just been purchased the day prior. Soon all that remained of the campsite were just some ashes from the fire. Everything else was gone. Unknown to the villagers was the fact that somewhere near this campsite was a hole that had been dug to store all of their money, gold, and valuables. Once the villagers had removed everything from the campsite or the hillside, it looked just like anywhere else in the area. And knowing Nebraska as I do, being a native, I am sure that the spring winds had scattered those ashes within a day or two, leaving little evidence of where this group had camped. Now, a few short years later, two men crossed the Missouri River on a ferry and they entered the town of Plattsmouth, Nebraska. They were part of this original group of 300 that were forced out a few years prior. They searched a couple miles west of town for days. They looked for the old campsite near the old road, and they had no luck relocating their old campsite as the winds and rain and erosion and farming had already started to drastically change the look of the countryside. So these discouraged men now made their way back into town and started to converse with the townfolk. They told the villagers that they were part of the 1859 party that were driven across the Missouri River by force, and they found out that the villagers held no ill will towards them and had basically forgot about the incident that had happened a few years prior. They let a few villagers know about the cache of money and gold that was located near the old campsite. They even found a few villagers that came with them to help them look for it. But as these stories go, of course, no one was able to find it. No one could even determine if they were in the exact correct spot or location for the old campsite. It became pretty clear that the villagers also didn't remember exactly where the campsite was. And I guess this makes sense when you think about it. I mean, how many groups of people had made their way through Plattsmouth and maybe camped outside of town? There could have been dozens or hundreds of groups that camped outside of town. How would someone remember exactly where this particular group had camped at that time, especially with it being many years earlier? It could also be possible that someone else from that same 1859 party had come back and been lucky enough to locate the campsite and been lucky enough to find the buried cache. But it's also highly possible that the fear of the townsfolk that they had put in the group kept them away for a few years like it did these two men, and they waited a few years to come back and look for the hoard of cache of gold and valuables, and it could be that others that came to look didn't find it either. So it's very possible that it could still be buried a couple miles west of Plattsmouth, Nebraska, on a low rise that was suitable for camping in the 1850s. Now, of course, the town has grown significantly since then, and much more of the surrounding countryside is in farmland now, and much of the land has been graded and leveled for farming, so there may be no low-rise hill outside of town anymore. It's hard to say, but the treasure could possibly still be out there. So that is the story of the lost cache of gold and coins and valuables just west of Plattsmouth, Nebraska. If you have any comments, you can leave it in the comments section. Thanks for listening.